Hello and welcome to a literary conversation with R.A. Salvatore. If you're watching on the live stream, please know that that will be moderated and you can put questions in the chat and hopefully we might be able to get to them closer to the end. So thank you all for being here. Give you a little introduction, although I'm not sure exactly how much introduction he needs. R.A. Salvatore, prefers Bob, has been, of course, an established author in the fantasy genre for over 30 years. His first novel of many, The Crystal Shard, which I just happen to have in my pocket, was published in 1988 and introduced the dark elf Drizzt Do'Urden. The novel is part of the Dungeons & Dragons Forgotten Realms novels, which he has 39 of, not counting the short stories, offering up sort of transmedia experiences in the tabletop role-playing games worlds, and the first book in the Icewind Dales trilogy. He's also the author of the high fantasy Demon Wars saga, and created the universe and lore for open-world fantasy RPG video game Kingdoms of Amalur: Reckoning, working with comic book author Todd McFarlane and others, including our own game design professor, Les Nelken. As well, Salvatore has written in the Star Wars universe, adapting Episode 2 as a novel. He got to work with George Lucas in the process. And the new Jedi Order series, Vector Prime, in 1999, in which he received death threats for killing Chewbacca, which she made very clear was not his choice. And we'll have more to say about these topics, particularly, I think, representation, writing for different media, and whatnot in a few minutes. His interest in literature and fantasy began with reading Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, while I learned today, stuck in his house during the blizzard of '78. Yep. And not able to go out, and also while he was a sophomore at Fitchburg State College.
No, freshman.
Pardon me?
Freshman.
A freshman. Okay,
Yep.
Sorry, I misread. Thank you for.
Well, it was '78. I started in '77.
Okay.
But that was the same year.
Okay, all right. A freshman at Fitchburg State College. He earned a degree in communications in 1981 and returned for a BA in English in 1991. Distinguished faculty, distinguished alumni in 2001, and he gave the address at the 115th commencement in 2011. We blame the pandemic for this not happening in 2021 to keep up with the 10-year streak. His books have sold more than 34 million copies worldwide, and he's regularly in the New York Times bestseller list. And he is here with us today to discuss the future of storytelling.
So thanks for joining us.
It's good to be back. It's weird. It's different and the same altogether. I had a lot of years here.
We just enjoyed a walk across campus to see kind of how different things looked. Too.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, when we talked briefly this summer to plan for this event, you told me you wanted good, challenging questions. You didn't want any softballs. So I took you up on that.
I didn't say that.
Uh-oh, I might be in trouble.
You heard that. I didn't say that.
It was
But
my
no.
own fantasy realm.
Just not Chewbacca.
Don't worry, it's not.
This guy over here is going to slug me. I can see it.
I heard the booing, yeah. Well, I actually went back to our library's archives and looked at some of the work you did for the student newspaper when you were a student.
I got in a lot of
rhetoric.
trouble for that.
Yes.
I really did. A lot of trouble for that.
I thought that would be interesting to talk about, and especially for some of our students here to think about. So we're here talking a little bit about the new major we're launching, digital media innovation, but it's also Constitution Week, and this event is part of that as well, and thinking about free speech. And even looking at some of the things you wrote, I think I picked up on some themes that you still wrestle with in your fiction today, thinking about like good and evil. And,
Absolutely.
So two of the pieces that stood out that I think
I know which ones you're going to say.
Of course you do.
Go ahead.
Do you want to?
No, go ahead.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So one was a critique of Reagan's policy of shooting down Libyan jets, and the other was
But it wasn't. But go ahead.
Okay, well, we can get into that. And the other was a piece about de-arming the campus security at the time.
That one got me in a lot of trouble.
Yeah. So there were a lot of people writing in letters to the editors about both of those.
Yep. Power of the word. That's where I learned the power of the word.
Yeah. And even the I think it was called the security department at the time, not the campus police, they jointly authored a letter that went so far as to accuse your writing of causing harm to officers on campus.
Yep.
But on the other hand, and I do have a quote for
But
this.
that's not what I said in the article.
And I want to hear more about that.
Okay.
But not everybody disagreed with the things you said. So at the time, the chair of the English department published a letter in support of your views about Libya. And so I thought I'd share that because it was pretty powerful. So he wrote, "Those of us who recognize intelligence, good writing, and coherent reasoning will applaud Mr. Salvatore, even when we perhaps disagree on particular points of argument. In the United States of America, not to be critical of one's government is not to be a responsible citizen. Mr. Salvatore should take comfort in the fact that he shares his point of view on the arms race with the wisest and most experienced analyst of Russian affairs in our country, George Kennan, former ambassador to Russia." So my question for you, kind of in light of all that, is I'm hoping you can just tell us a little bit more about what those experiences were
Who
like.
was that?
I would have to go back. I don't have it in my notes, actually.
I don't remember who the chair was.
The chair in 1981, if anybody, English chair of 1981.
Was it Bill Barker, maybe? Colin Bourne. I bet it was Colin Bourne. Well, anyway.
Okay.
Okay.
So what was that like for you? And then the second part to connect to our students is, in terms of, we're talking about free speech, like how might you connect that to students today wrestling with like politically charged issues and this idea of cancel culture even on social media?
Okay, first of all, I'm Italian, which means that we love having big dinners and argue politics. And see, even the way you just characterized those two things were a little different. What I wrote in that piece about Libya was the reaction of people to seeing other human beings being killed when those jets were going down. And all I said in that piece was, these are people, these are human beings. Somebody's dad just died. Somebody's husband just died. Somebody's son just died. Maybe sometimes you have to do horrible things, but it's not a football game. That was my whole point in that piece. It wasn't about whether Reagan was right or wrong about bombing Libya. I'm not although I love foreign affairs and I pay very close attention to them, that wasn't the point. All the point I was trying to make is have a little humility to be better than that which you are fighting. Mm-hmm. And I took a lot of heat from that. Traitor. Yeah, right. Not like, but if you're going to put yourself out there, you're going to take heat. And if you can't do it, then don't do it. And that's where I really learned where the heat starts. Mm-hmm. And then the other one you mentioned, if you read my article, all I was doing was presenting points of view of different students. It was more of a straight reporting piece. But when that article came out, there was a cartoon that was put above it of a overweight campus cop on a tricycle holding a penknife. And I had no say in that. I was horrified when I saw it. I said, they're going to read this piece completely. This is just a straight news piece about the debate about whether they should have the long-handled flashlights or other weaponry. I was absolutely neutral on the subject. I was a commuter. I was trying to report it like from the outside looking in because this wasn't affecting me. I wasn't up here when those problems were happening. I was at work. But they put that, and that's when I first learned that the way you present things, and I'm seeing it today. How many times have you seen a headline put up on Twitter or Facebook or whatever social media, and then you read the article and you realize that the headline is the opposite of what that article is actually saying? That was the trap I got in with that second piece. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, if we can't share ideas, then the person who's going to make all our ideas for us is going to do bad things. Mm-hmm. And those themes are in my books. My books are about ethics. More than anything else, my books are about ethics. They're about the content of someone's character. They're about, and that's how you judge them. They're about potential redemption, no matter who you are, no matter what you've done. There may be a course of redemption. That's my Catholic upbringing. I can't escape it, no matter how hard I try. So yeah, but that was a wild time. That was the first time I really understood the power of the word. Mm-hmm. I thought it was kind of cool, actually.
What would you tell students who might be, wrestling with those ideas today? Because this idea of cancel culture is pretty prominent, and really having to be careful of what you say.
I got an email the other day from some guy, and this is really funny, because he said, I heard you gone woke and changed the dark elves. My books have been the same since 1987 in terms of the philosophy and the ethics regarding race and dark elves and all the rest of it. And I'm never reading one of your books again. So my answer to him was, well, I'll still watch my Mel Gibson movies and my Chuck Norris movies while you can revel in promoting cancel culture. Congratulations. So yeah, I mean, look, my son said it best to me when this first started and this whole stuff really started. One thing I have going for me, and one of the reasons why I think I'm still able to write books that are relating, is because I have 3 really wonderful kids who are not afraid to tell me what are things I don't know. And my son said to me something that I take with me every day. He said, you're not woke, you're waking. If you are a human being and you are not waking, you are not becoming a better person. And that's how I look at it. And it's really funny because we're so off the rails at the point where we can't even talk to each other anymore. I have far left people calling me a neoliberal with some sneer, as if that's supposed to mean something. It really doesn't. And I have the right-wingers calling me a woke libtard. Again, they're just using words that they think mean something that don't mean anything. Talk to me about an issue, and I'll tell you what I think about it, honestly. And if you disagree with me, I'm not going to hate you for disagreeing with me. Maybe I'll learn something because you disagree with me. I'm a writer. It's what I'm supposed to do. Learn. So for you guys, and you do have to recognize what's my tolerance for abuse. I've told people a million times, for anyone here who wants to be a writer, this is my truth. Being a writer is walking naked through Times Square at noon on a busy day. There's no place to hide. There's no place to hide. You're putting it out there, and if somebody gets something out of your book that you didn't put in there, and they will all the time, you can't tell them they're wrong because that's what they got. So you just have to accept it.
That's fantastic. Thanks. I noticed you.
Do they get easier? Jerk.
Well, we'll see. I'm going to transition to fiction, so maybe that'll be your more natural home. And you started making those connections yourself. You said that's what comes through in your writing. It's about ethics. And I found an interview you did in July for the Telegram and Gazette, and you said the hero should be the guy with the biggest heart, who cares and does things for the right reasons. Even if he's wrong, he's trying to do right. And so I was seeing a connection there, even with your time as a student in writing in the student newspaper, that searching for what's right, trying to find that right perspective. Like you said, those people who are killed, even if we don't agree with them, even if we had to do it, those are other human beings. And so I feel that connection also comes through in your fiction and your fantasy. And so I guess I was trying to think about, what do you think is the role of fiction in helping us sort through those kinds of ethical questions and develop that point of view in our own lives?
I think fiction can strip down to the bones the things that can be so like glossed over time. Mm-hmm. Because I don't think you go down a rabbit hole all at once. You go down one handful of dirt at a time. And if you're listening in an echo chamber of any persuasion or ideology, it can take you down that rabbit hole. And again, I go back to Fitchburg State, where I learned about Marshall McLuhan and the concept of numbing. When Gone with the Wind came out, Rhett Butler said, frankly, my dear, I don't give a damn. And people got up and walked out in horror. They couldn't believe someone said damn in the movie. The second time it happened, it didn't have the same effect. The third time, it had less of effect. That's numbing. That's how propaganda works. That's how language works. That's how society moves forward or moves backwards. And if you watch, like the Ken Burns documentaries, you see that this is a cycle that goes on over and over and over again. If you watch the Ken Burns documentary on the Holocaust that's out right now, and you listen to some of the things that people were saying, and you look at public sentiment, you hear those echoes very dangerously. If you're not seeing them today, you're not looking. Fiction can take and accelerate the process so that you don't get numbed and wind up down here when we're trying to tell you, wait a minute, you can read the book in a couple of days and you're already at the point where you would be horrified. I know many people today who, if their younger self heard some of the things they were saying, would be horrified. But they got led down a rabbit hole, and there they're stuck. So I'll give you a perfect example, Handmaid's Tale, right? You watch it, you read it, and you think, this is preposterous. And you look around and you say, wait a minute. It may take 10 years, it may take 20 years. These kind of things are possible. They're possible. So I think that's the role of fiction, is to strip the veneers away. And the other thing is, I don't think the role of fiction is to give you the answers. I think the role of fiction is to get you to ask the questions and find your own damn answers. Because we're probably not going to disagree on which rabbit hole's a good rabbit hole or a bad rabbit hole. And that's okay. If I get you asking the questions, at least you'll be thinking about those things.
Yeah, that's fantastic, right? Because we're not going to always agree on every single issue. And
Oh, God, no.
So just being able to focus in on what the issue is even is an important way to distill that. Yeah. And I think Frank is going to delve a little more into that.
Uh-oh. They're teaming up on me. Help me.
Yes.
Right, tag team, right? So what I want to pivot to a little bit is talking about tabletop gaming and Drist and the Drow and representations of the Drow. And I think you've already mentioned a lot about the ethical issues, and I think that's really key to the way that a lot of this has worked. So you spoke with us and in interviews about how the hobby has grown, the gaming hobby has grown up, and the medium of fantasy has evolved. And of course, like, there's always going to be growing pains that accompany this sort of thing, right? Tearing down or rebuilding previously established tropes and demographics. In a 2012 interview with GameSpot, you noted, quote, "If you turned up to one of my book signings in the late 80s, you found 195 out of 200 people there were teenage boys. But if you come to one of my book signings now, it looks more like a Fleetwood Mac concert."
Yeah.
To which my question is, Tusk or Rumors? No,
Tusk.
sorry. Yeah.
Tusk.
Mothers, fathers, grandparents, right. So along with that shift has been, of course, a very big shift in how race and gender have been represented. Could you talk a little bit about some of your own?
Sure. When I say that, there was one interview I gave recently where they put a terrible headline to go along with it, that said, R.A. Salvatore thinks that Dungeons & Dragons, that the Drow were created on horrible racist tropes and he's going to stop that. That's not what I said. And that's not what I ever said, because I would never accuse someone of racism unless they earned it. And I know a lot of the guys who were with the creation of Dungeons & Dragons, and if they had that, I never saw it. That doesn't mean they didn't. That doesn't mean they did. I didn't know them enough. I would never make that kind of an accusation. My point was, at that time, and I hope this is true, and I hope you guys can break through what I see as a pattern emerging. You have to look at history in context. Okay? I grew up with 5 older sisters. My oldest sister was class salutatorian, and she was brilliant. But the weight of being a woman trying to accomplish something in the 60s buried her. She had a good life. She did a good job and all of that. She could have done something magnificent. My next oldest sister was the class valedictorian, who went into political science, wound up getting pregnant in college. She married a man, she got pregnant in college, and then became a housewife, which was expected of her. She did what was expected of her. She would have been a campaign knockout working for somebody. Brilliant. My next older sister came here, became a nurse practitioner. She should have been a surgeon, but that wasn't, she was told you're not supposed to be a nurse. Fitchburg State is a great nursing program. Great profession. She could have been a surgeon. She could have done anything she wanted in medicine. My next older sister basically dropped out of school because she just got tired of hearing it. And she didn't drop out. She did well. She got great grades, but she didn't go to college. And my next older sister was super successful she's an English professor down in Maryland. She's retired. She opened a cat shelter. She's working harder now than she did when she was working because she loves cats. And she's just this wonderful, brilliant person, might be the smartest person in the family. And my point of that is that when I started writing, I have admitted this. I was sexist. And so were they. Because we all thought we had roles to play, and it was just an agreed upon. We're just agreeing that this is the way things are going to be. And it was stupid. And the one thing that always, from the very beginning to me, rang out as the stupidest invention of mankind is racism. That's just a construct. It means nothing. It's stupid. It's dumb. It's debilitating. It weakens society. It weakens individuals. Just to even think that way, it makes no sense to me. I get that from my dad. My dad gave me that. It was the best gift he ever gave me, was the understanding of people are just people. And so anyway, what I meant by that trope is that I was ignorant of it, that the idea of blacker equals more evil is the horrible trope I was talking about. And it's a really and a pervasive and a terrible thing. That's what we need to be rid of in the genre, even if that representation wasn't meant that way. And it's easy enough to do, because the only thing I care about with this guy is that from afar, someone can look at him and see him as the other and judge him before he opens his mouth. That's the beginning and end of it for me. So they tried to turn this into some like crusade I was on against the people who made D&D, and nothing like that. It's just an idea of waking up and recognizing the perspective of other people and how little things that you don't even think about, especially you don't think about it if you're the dominant culture, right? The things you don't even think about actually have affect. That's what the books have been about.
And maybe to connect that back to our question about like what fiction can do, one of the things that you have said is that what's nice about fantasy is you can have truly evil characters in a way that don't exist in reality. So you can have kind of guilt-free battles. And that's part of what
it's part of the fun of fantasy is the idea of an adventure where you're fighting true evil. Mm-hmm. And I mean, in the wars, if you look at the wars that we've fought and you look at like the flyers and the newspapers that went around, the governments involved on every side, the first thing they tried to do was dehumanize the enemy, right? That's the first thing you do. You make them not feel bad about killing other people because these aren't people, right? And I never bought into that. That's what got me in trouble with that article. They're human beings. They're people. They have the same hopes, the same desires, the same love interests, the same family interests as you do. At least care, right? But in fantasy, you can get away from that. You can use demons. You can use dragons. You can use monsters, not people. And I always found that fun to play the games and to write about for those reasons. That doesn't mean I can't throw the occasional hiccup in, the occasional, wait a minute, where my main character in one short story I wrote back in the mid-90s called Dark Mirror, where this guy, who's a ranger, and in the game, rangers are avowed enemies of the goblin kind, right? They're the evil ones. So he goes into a town and he meets a goblin. And the goblin, what are you doing in here? And he finds out that the goblin's an escaped slave. And the goblin seems like a pretty cool dude. And then by the end of the story, they've captured him. Spoiler alert, it's 1995, get over it. They've recaptured him and they hang him. And this character, who was trained to fight goblin kind for the good of man, goes, wait a minute. And it blows his mind, because what have I been doing? And he's the hero. He's not the villain. But I've been playing with that from the very beginning because I didn't have the answers. And again, I'm not trying to give anyone any answers. It's just because I was trying to sort things out in my own head. I write because it helps me make sense of a world that too often makes no sense. This is how I make sense of the world.
There's so much about that there with just the humanization of creatures that we've even, you know, like a goblin that are just these disposable enemies that you'll just throw out even to like lower level characters, right? Just this way of coming in and embodying something that we're able to understand otherness and understand those different perspectives. And I do think that's something really, really key with narrative. You mentioned this earlier in Dr. Tracy's class, but if you don't mind, it just seems interesting to circle back to, as we were talking about storytelling, and the idea of point of view in that.
Yes.
And you started pushing, working between like, having Drist, having short essays, sort of journal entries and things in first person up against third person
Right.
Perspective. Could you talk maybe just a little bit, this is a little bit away from maybe the larger questions around representation, but I think it's an interesting thing to think about mechanically what fiction can do in terms of showing alternate points of view, because you would really shift point of view really quickly in a way that writers before you would not.
Yeah, and that was as I was telling the story in the class, that was like one of my proudest moments is when they changed their style guide to do it the way I did it because people were catching on. So I basically turned in a book, and I wanted to get in the heads of all the characters, good and bad, in that book and show who they were, to flesh them out more than just from the perspective of the hero, the protagonists. So I had lots of point of view shifts, and I would separate them with 5 stars. I just put 5 stars, center it, and then, you know, in the battle scene, you got Dritz fighting over here, you got Bruno fighting over here, you got Canterbury fighting over here, whatever. And my editor told me, you can't do that. You can't do that. I said, what do you mean? He says, writing 101, Bob, you don't change point of view. I said, well, yeah, but that's a different world. What do you mean? I said, I can do that. You can't, you'll confuse people. Were you confused? No, shut up. And he goes, but I'm a trained reader, and he was a wonderful man. I'm not trying to put him down. I drove him into the Unitarian Church, by the way. He's a minister now. I did that to him. I love you, Eric, if you're watching. I do, he's a wonderful man. But I said, no, you don't understand that if you go back to the rules of writing, those rules of writing were written for people who read all the time. This was their primary form of gathering information. The families would sit by the fire and read books together. That's not the world. The world is TV. And now it's gone even beyond that to social media, video games, all this other stuff. But at that time I was growing up, it was TV. I grew up with the Beverly Hillbillies, Gilligan's Island, Lost in Space was my favorite. The old one, not the new one. In fact, Billy, just as an aside, Will Robinson did one of my books in audio. Blew my mind. It was wonderful. Anyway, Billy Mooney did it. But television is point of view shift. That's all it is. You go from one character, one actor to the other, right? Ross, I'm going to date myself again like I did in the class. Ross says something, Rachel says something, Joey says something. Boom, boom, boom. You're going, and the actors are giving you the point of view of them, of the characters. Well, that's what I did in the books. And he said, well, I don't think this is going to work. I said, I think this is really going to work. Please, just let me get away with this. And besides, I'm not rewriting the book. We're out of time. I only had 4 months to write the book, so we're out of time. And so he did it, and it worked. And that allows me to play with these themes a lot more. Now, with Dritz and the essays, the new book just came out yesterday called The Tao of Dritz. It's a collection of all the essays from the beginnings of the sections of the, I always break those books up into 3, 4, or 5 sections. It's a collection of all the essays that he did to start each, including the essays from the book that's coming next year, which I had to write before I wrote the book. I'd never done that before. But anyway, the reason I did those is when they told me after the third book, the first series had come out, the Crystal Shard, Streams of Silver, Halfling's Gem. And Halfling's Gem had hit the New York Times. Everything was going great. The publisher was like, we're getting so many letters about this dark elf character. They want to know where he came from. Do a prequel. And this is around 1989, 1990. And so they wanted me to go back and tell where Dritz came from. So I thought this would be a great first-person book. But then the more I thought about it, he's a baby at the beginning. Can't be his perspective. And then I want to do battle scenes. You can't do battle scenes first person unless they're just an individual fight. You can't. If I'm over here fighting you and you're over there fighting him, if I look over there, he kills me. So I don't know what's going on over here. You can't do it first person. So to kind of bridge the gap, I started doing the journal entries. And those are strange because like at first, for a long time, I was getting people saying, "Oh, why are you preaching to me?" And I'd have to explain to them, this is him talking to himself. This is reflection. This isn't meant for you. You're not supposed to be reading this. Quit peeking over his shoulder. That's the point of them. But that's how it came about, because I was not going to stay in one character's head the whole time. I wanted to be in the head of even the bad guys, because I didn't want the bad guys to just be, he's evil. That's kind of what I was trying to get away from, especially when it involved the reasoning creatures, if you will, as opposed to just the demonic monsters or devils or undead, whatever, that happen to show up.
Yeah, I think that's interesting because you mentioned, especially maybe if we can pull that thread a little about the impact of media, not just on society and how it impacts all of us, but even I think you were alluding to your writing style in there, that kind of growing up in an era of television shifted how you were writing.
Oh, yeah. I don't think most of the people in this room who are way younger than my kids absorb information the same way I do. And that's not an insult in any way, shape, or form. I think in some ways they're way more sophisticated, can carry on 6 phone conversations like this, and I can't even hit my phone that many times without hurting myself, and and keep track of it all in ways that I never could. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I think one of the things I was talking about in the meeting is my writing has actually changed, because if you look at the old way we were taught to write, there were 2 truisms, right, about dialogue. One is, if you have to use an adjective, the road to hell is paved with adverbs. If you have to use an adverb, then you're doing your dialogue wrong, because how they're saying something should be able to come through in the dialogue itself. If someone's saying something sarcastically, it should be obvious that it's sarcastic in the dialogue, and you shouldn't have to say he said sarcastically. And the second thing is attributing dialogue. If characters have their own voice, their own motivation, and the reader's reading that, they should be able to tell who's speaking without you saying, Dritz said, Caddy Bree said, Bruner said. But that's not true anymore. And it's not true anymore because in the things that many of the younger people have gained, this is my perception of things, have gained in being able to absorb so much more information, is that those types of subtleties have been sacrificed. And so I find that if I don't use an adverb, people don't get when someone's joking. And the concept of unreliable narrator, you said that these drow were evil. I said, I did not say that. The character said that. The character said it. I said, the character's wrong. Oh. Those are the kinds of things that don't really translate as well to the type of society that we're asking people to survive in and thrive in now. Secondly, if you go to any social media platform, or before that, the message boards, the one thing you know for sure is that every post, every tweet, every reply has attribution. So attribution becomes like second nature to the reader. So I began to discover that when I was not attributing dialogue to a character, I was losing readers. They were getting confused on who was speaking. So my writing is actually adapted to fit more modern sensibilities about adverbs don't pave the way toward hell, they pave the way toward understanding, right? And don't let them get confused over who's saying what, because they've got more important things to do in the story, absorbing other parts of the story. Yeah, it's a living language, it's a living society, and everything up here is living and changing and evolving.
So the road to hell is paved thoroughly with adverbs.
Probably.
All right.
That was sarcastic? You missed it. I'm
Right. Oh, I didn't put the emoji after it, right? You didn't know. You didn't know.
/S.
Exactly. Yeah, /S. Yeah, it actually reminds me, Charles Lamb, the early 19th century essayist, said this is something to the effect, I'm going to get the quote wrong, but irony is that which the audience misses. Right. So it's often that question. I kind of want to talk a little bit about games and writing,
Sure.
and writing and games. And I'm going to start kind of with the big social stuff to sort of stick with some of the questions around race and representation, because it has been such a big issue for Wizards of the Coast, the makers of Dungeons and Dragons. So if you don't know the minutia of D&D's rule set, I'll do this as lightly as possible. But the gaming system uses race within its rule set and applies modifiers to character abilities and skills based off of that. So if you're a high elf, you're going to have higher intelligence. If you're a tiefling, which is sort of a sexy, half demonic type, at least I think they're sexy, they have high charisma. Of course they're sexy, right? So even within the current 5th edition, which came out in 2014, the drow are still marked in that IP as evil.
Yep.
And in 2020, there was a really strong backlash on social media, and at the time of the Black Lives Matter protest about that, blackness as alterity, blackness as evil. And Wizards of the Coast began to address the way that the drow and the orcs were portrayed, and more importantly, at least I'm saying more importantly, made an effort to diversify its hiring. And I guess that's just that I think that we can do a lot of things with our dolls, but I think we need to think a lot about who gets to tell the stories too.
Absolutely.
But in that interview in Polygon that you mentioned that had the really misleading title, you said that, and this was in regard to Starlight Enclave, The Way of the Drow, the 2021 book, if the drow are being portrayed as evil, that's a trope that has to go away, be buried under the deepest pit and never brought out again. I was unaware of that. I admit I was oblivious. And you've talked a lot about just growth and change and development in that. So I guess I'm just really interested in, like, how did you see that evolution and what did you think needed to change within that?
See, this had been going on between me and Wizards, not in an adversarial way,
Right.
for a long time. Way before Black Lives Matter movement, way before all of this. Where the logical, Starlight Enclave has been planned for over a decade before I wrote it. Not the particulars of the story, but the fact that of what it was going to mean for the character. Because here's the thing. The drow you see in the early books live in the Underdark, the deep Underdark, where that's the kind of where the planes join to the lower, the planes of, like, the abyss and the 9 hells. That's the barrier. So the Demon Queen, who deceived them and put them down that rabbit hole in their culture over millennia, is an absolute tyrant, has an absolute hold on them. What are you going to do? You don't agree with her? You have no power. You don't agree with her? You better keep it to yourself. We're going to make you a Drider, which is this half spider, half drow abomination. And you'll be in pain every move you make for the rest of your life. Severe pain. It's just horrible. If you have someone that's got that kind of complete control over media, if you will, using her priestesses that are the most favorable, the most zealous to her, get more powerful magics to throw around. They own the place. It's that simple. If you're just a regular person and you're coming up and you say, well, but this is wrong, because that's a matriarchal society that is hugely sexist against the males, the men in that society. They have a couple of things they might be able to accomplish, but they can't be priests. They should just be a little wizard, you'll be okay, you know? So they have that. If you come up and you see that as wrong, or you come up and say, well, wait a minute, you just sent me to the surface world to slaughter elven babies as wrong, you can't do it. What are you going to do about it? Mm-hmm. If you leave your dead, the Underdark's full of things that will eat you. From the very beginning, and this is where the argument came between me and many of the people around the table at TSR, Wizards of the Coast. It was not TSR anymore by this point. They said, how are we going to fix this? I said, well, the way you're going to fix this is, first of all, let me go back in time like I was planning to do in these books, and I will show more of the drow who felt the same way as Drizzt. He's not unique. He was never unique in the books. There were many other characters in the books. His father, one of his sisters, Jarl Axel, who weren't evil people. They were just trying to survive in an evil place. So let me show more of that. And let's show a drow society that never got trapped by Loth. And then it came up, we should change the skin color. And I said, I don't think you should. I don't think you need to. But that was a decision that had its pros and cons. And they, and I'm part of a team with that. And there were some good points to be made doing that as well, to kind of sever that tie as quickly as possible. My point was, when I show you Starlight Enclave, I also showed them through the memories of one of their long-dead matron mothers of the city that the history they had been taught about the place might not be the actual history of the place. That it might be that the people that went down there were doing it to escape the whims of kings and queens on the surface who kept going to war because they didn't like what someone said about their cousin. Does this sound familiar to people? And when they started that Menzoberranzan, it was a liberal democracy in a world full of kingdoms and theocratic countries, autocratic kingdoms. But by controlling the message over time, completely warped it. And, it's funny when they first told me go back and say where he came from, I had the old modules. Gary Gygax had written some old modules, but they really didn't tell you much. The Queen of the Demon Web Pits and all this gave you kind of like this 10,000-foot look at a slice of a few drow here and there, right? And I had the one-page description of drow in, I think it was one of the source books that came out. If you want to play a drow, you can do this. Here's how your statistics will change if you're playing a drow. Don't go in sunlight or whatever. But I had that was all I had. Mm-hmm. So I said, okay, well, what else is there? I've got this very basic information about the drow. What else is? They have some snake-headed whips that are live snakes that'll bite you. And they have, they're matriarchal. What else? And they said, well, that's all we have. I said, so what are you telling me to do? They said, we're giving you carte blanche to create the drow the city Dritz came from, which I had already alluded to, but to actually expand upon it in the Forgotten Realms. And so the first thing I thought of is, what is a place that would look evil from the outside, but actually has codes of honor and actually has codes within it to keep it from wiping itself out, essentially. And I picked up my copy of Mario Puzo's The Godfather, and I read about the 5 families of New York. And I basically based the house structures of Menzoberranzan on the way that society was based. The New York Mafia families. But coming back around to the point, I have a friend wonderful man, who has done tremendous work in the gaming industry. He's made gobs of money through good business decisions, one of the most ethical human beings I've ever met in my life. I love him to death. And he put a post up on Facebook a few months ago, and he said, I want to dedicate the rest of my professional life toward making gaming more inclusive. Tell me some things I should do. And my answer to him was, the first thing is, don't tell anyone you're doing it, just do it. And this is the same thing I said to Wizards of the Coast when I begged them not to put out the website for Dritz and about the new types of drow that were being discovered before Starlight Enclave came out. Because I wanted the reader to be as shocked as the companions were when they found a society of drow living in a glacier at the North Pole. Huh? I wanted that to be the oh my God moment. But it was all out before the book came out. And I really think that threw some walls up of communication between people who felt like they were being attacked, not for being racist, but because they didn't see some things as racist. I don't see drow as black, I see them as elves, right? But I think that threw some walls up. And it was interesting. I have learned long ago avoid reviews of books, especially after I killed Chewie. But I was curious to see the reaction. And if you look at Starlight Enclave, which is a logical, nothing different at all concerning the consistency, the growth, the logical circle of this character that had been planned decade ago and more. You will be I was not amazed to find out that the one-star reviews were all about politics. And that was my fear. That was my fear. Again, that's fiction. The work of fiction, the job of fiction is to bring people to places where they can see what's going on and make their own decisions about them, not telling them what's what.
I wanted to follow up on that idea of the matriarchal society that is
I had 5
sexist.
oldest sisters.
Yeah. Well, so when
Where did the drow come from? By the way, they all always ask me, am I Vienna? Because Vienna was the good one. And I always said, no.
Well, so you said earlier also that sometimes when you're in the majority culture, it's harder to see some of the problems that are present. And then, so I was thinking, just as like a historical parallel, former Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, before she became a justice and she was a lawyer, she would often bring cases that were related to sexism but about men. And then if she won that case for men, those rights would be expanded to women.
Sure.
So I'm wondering, like as a parallel in your fiction, the idea like working with a matriarchal society that is sexist against men, even thinking about some of those, like journal entries of Dritz, if that's, he works through some of those questions about that in there. If you can do that in a different way because it's a matriarchal society.
Well, I didn't come up with a matriarchal society. That was presented in the modules that came before me.
Sure.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, one of the most influential books in my life that I read was a book called Black Like Me. It's about a Southern white guy who went to the doctor and had his skin darkened and lived life as a Negro in the South. And that book literally blew my mind. Okay, literally, and I'm a writer that said that things fell out of my ear when I read that. No, that book just put everything I always believed was just like, this really is the dumbest damn thing ever. That his life would change that dramatically. This is absurd. So yeah, and the same thing with the matriarchal society. Being able to work through those things is what these books have been about since 1987. Absolutely. And I think it's still amazing some of the early letters I would get on that stuff, but I won't go into that now. We don't have enough time. But I think maybe it wasn't anything I did consciously, but I think the fact that it was that way, and most of my readership at that time were men, young men. That was the fantasy genre. I said 100, I lied, 195. I didn't have 195 of my book signings. It was like 30 at that time. But yeah, it was mostly teenage boys, maybe college students, military. That was it, and the moms that drove them. That was it. So yeah, I think that maybe that did make some people go, oh yeah. I hope it did. Again, ask the questions, find your own answers.
So something else I wanted to pull through that, and again, maybe this circles back a little bit to some of the discussions you had earlier today, but just your use of history, and you mentioned The Godfather and the creation of, can you talk a little bit just generally about like world building and the way that, because so often we can create these worlds and they just kind of don't cohere, and yours do. What are some of the things?
That's
you think
my favorite part of being a writer is creating the worlds that I'm going to write in. And with the realms, I got to create like Icewind Dale, Menzoberranzan, all different parts of it, because the realms were it was like a broad overview with certain areas fleshed out, and we could just basically run with the other ones. But when they did my Demon Wars book, it was the same books, it was the same thing. I love history rhymes. cultures are the way they are for a reason. Go find out the reason. It's geography, it's neighbors, it's things develop, how the customs develop. Why in Florence in, pre-Renaissance times, that goes on to this day, do they have calcio storico, where they go into a ring and it's like rugby without rules, where these people train all year to go in the ring. 4 teams from the different districts of Florence go into a ring and beat the ever-loving crap out of each other. This is their entire life is training for this. And why? What led them to do a blood sport in Florence? But then you go to Italy or you go to Germany and you see a castle on every hill, the ruins of a castle. Because that's what they were doing. They were just fighting each other for land all the time. So you always had to be ready to do it. So when I was doing Caladay, which is the new society up at the glacier, I really wanted to do pre-Renaissance Florence to an extent. And again, I say to an extent because I'm not making it that, but I'm taking what made Florence like that and I'm translating it to what would make Caladay similar. What echoes can I get from that? My Demon Wars world, I do it even more. I have, in the last series I wrote, The Coven, you had these remote tribes, basically around Lake Tahoe, because the Coven is loosely based on the whole Demon Wars world is loosely based on our world. It's not, but it's geographically similar. And so you had these tribes that got everything they wanted from the lake, except for the 8th tribe that lived up on Mount Heavenly, right, above Lake Tahoe, who had this cave full of crystals, and gems are the magic source, and these crystals emanate magic. And they have witches who are respected, but that's a very patriarchal tribe up there, who can access the magic. And that they have they call it the God crystal. It's just this giant crystal sticking out of the ground, throwing heat, so even when the mountain's 8 feet deep in snow, it's just wet there. And it's warm. So but they didn't have the resources up there where their God was. The resources were down at the lake. So they'd just go and raid every now and then and take what they needed, including sometimes slaves. And so this world developed to match cultures that I would see around the world based on geography. And the last book in that series, unexpectedly to me, a new race of I don't want to call them race, a new culture of very distinct looking humans with golden skin and the face of a mandrill almost, with the red nose and the white and the blue. Very beautiful. Everything is gold with them. They have gold on all their temples. They have gold on their buildings. Everything is shining. It's all about the light with them. With the events of the first 2 books opened a prophecy of theirs that it was time to reestablish their empire from sea to sea. So they come roaring out of what's basically the LA basin, across the mountains, all the way to the world, across the world that I have built in. At that time, there were 11 other books. The original Demon Wars series, which was very almost Western European. The Coven series with the witches, they roll right over that area, all the way, and they built. And then at the end of that, they almost look like the British Empire of the 17th, 18th centuries, right? Because now they've conquered the world. And they realize they might want to stay because gold is their source of magic. It's not just really pretty, it's their source of magic. And they find out that if they go south, there are gold mines. Their boats, if they take their boats south, they can't go directly south because the kingdom directly south of them is ruled by a queen who has a dragon and was friends with the people they just conquered. So they have to stay offshore, way offshore. Don't mess with the dragon. But they find gold flowing. So they've got this rich gold trade going back to the west. So the powers in the west are reinforcing them. It looks like the British Empire. So my next series, which I just wrote the first book and coming out probably in 2024, is the natural outcropping of that. Pirates. We have pirates. And the pirates are going to overthrow the British, essentially. And again, these are different. There's different purposes, there's different cultures, but it will rhyme with the histories we know. And that's what makes it fun, and that's what makes it rich. And the other thing is, when you're writing fantasy books, if you're reading one of my books, I am asking you to suspend disbelief. A man can throw a lightning bolt, right? A person can heal their wounds with magic. There are dragons. There are demons running around. There are goblins. I'm asking you to suspend your disbelief. So the less I make you suspend your disbelief on the way the cultures interact or the way the cultures behave, the way people behave in the world, the more you will be drawn into the story and can forget about the fact that there's really a dragon there.
We have to, we need the everyday details, the cultural points, those sorts of things, so that we can have that level of engrossment then to where it's okay to understand a dragon, right?
Yeah, it makes sense to me.
There's a video game question.
Sure. So we talked about part of what we're thinking about now is the new major that we're launching on campus, digital media innovation, and that has a couple pathways that students can explore. Digital cultural heritage is one, which I think might have some connections to this conversation. Data studies is one, but also digital storytelling. And so I know you've done a lot of work writing across different media as well. So
Yeah.
a lot of books, but you've done work on video games as well, for example.
Just
and
did
so,
more work with Cryptic. My son and I are doing a new quest line for Cryptic for their Neverwinter game.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
So I guess in terms of the question then, could you maybe talk to us a little bit about what you see as the differences in world building or even storytelling between those different media? Because students working in this new major might be writing for, not just video games, but also like virtual reality, augmented reality, and those kinds of tools. So what do you see as the differences there?
Well, it's the same as being a good dungeon master or a bad dungeon master in the game, okay? A good dungeon master lets the players tell him where they're going next. A bad dungeon master hooks his fingers up their nose and drags them where he needs them to go. When I'm writing books, I am giving you characters, friends. I'm giving you characters through whom you can live vicariously. You will see the world through the eyes of Dritz de Warden. You will see the world through the eyes of Caddy Brie. You will see the world through the eyes of Owlin. You will see the world through the, et cetera, et cetera. When you're writing for video games, the first thing that you should always keep in your mind is the most important character in that game to the player is the player's character. So your job is to try to give that character, that player, a world to explore that makes sense, that will allow them to go on grand adventures and improve their character, right? Loot. They want loot. They want to get better. They want their character to get better. Whatever your loot system is, maybe it's material goods, weapons, maybe it's just development of the character, more skills, whatever. And I think that's the most important thing to keep in mind. That's the primary difference. Other than that, creating a world, when I created Amalur, and I can't say I created Amalur, when the team that I worked with created Amalur, first thing I did is I hired my D&D group to work with me to come up with a history of the world. And we came up with a 5,000-year history of this world. And I can't give it away because it's owned by someone who bought it from the state of Rhode Island. And that would be breaking protocol if I told you what it was. But it's a pretty mind-blowing story that's like every Saturday morning show you used to watch when guys are in the woods convincing each other that Bigfoot's under the bush over there and that type of thing. Or the ancient aliens were here and things like that. And it's this grand 5,000-year history of the world that we came up with. I created the skeleton of it with one other writer who was in my group who now I think is running Diablo for Blizzard. He's bigwig over at Blizzard now, doing great, wonderful career he's built for himself. And then we had this narrative team that came in. And what I really did with them is I tried to get them to think about consequence of magic, consequence of technology, consequence of what's changing. In an MMO, a massive multiplayer online game, I'm sure you probably all know what an MMO is, but most audiences that I talk to don't. Your character can die. And then you will respawn in the graveyard in WoW, or where you last bound, probably all the way around the other side of the world because you're stupid and forgot to bind somewhere else in EverQuest. And in WoW, you have to get back near your character to resurrect yourself. You come back to life, and you just sit down and drink a little, and then you're ready to go. Whereas like in the game of EverQuest, you had to find your body, drag your body to a safe spot, loot your stuff off the body, which usually left lines of your corpses in a zone because you died in a bad place and now you're back there basically naked in the same bad place, which is not going to go well for you. So in our world, to answer the question, instead of just saying this is what happens, one of the conceits of the world was that this is why it happened. Not just why the gnomes were able to come up with this well of souls that will basically be an immortality machine, but why it worked now and it didn't work before is the bigger story of the game that I can't tell you. Okay, great. So we've done this well of souls. Your character dies. You're gonna come through the well in this beautiful music transition back to the world again alive, and the gnomes built it, and that's why you can do it. So what I told the team was, what does that mean? What does that mean? If I walked out tomorrow onto a stage as president of Bobbyland and said, I have a pill that will grant you immortality, you would hear cheers. Who wouldn't be happy? I'll tell you who wouldn't be happy. A parent of extreme faith who lost their kid and is sure that in the afterlife they're going to see that kid again. Right? I don't know if they're right or wrong, but I know they wouldn't want to stick around forever if they actually believed that when they've done their time here, their job here, there was something better waiting for them. Who wouldn't be happy? The person who's just lost someone the day before. Who wouldn't be happy? Some of the churches whose entire reason for being is because people are afraid of death. So think about that. Think about how, if you have a corrupt church who are suddenly realizing we're about to lose all our power, how would they react to something like that? This is what we were trying to do with the MMO for Amalur, is go down and have quest lines that showed you those other instances. What would happen if this really happened? Instead of just saying, okay, you're back to life, go back and fight the monster again.
Wow, that's really interesting. And so as we're thinking about the future of storytelling broadly, I mean, I think some of the things we've talked about is like really being more aware and conscientious of how we write about things like race and gender, shifting the way we storytell for more digital approaches. And I think I started hearing you discuss too, even, you know, as changing media has shifted the way you write novels, there's a shift even in games as well, because of like how people are willing to play the games. And so maybe as we kind of bring this to a close before we go to audience questions, you could say a little bit more about what you see that shift in the future of storytelling in the digital realm and how that's changing.
I'm not sure yet, because here's the difference. Okay, if I write a book and I put something in it that twangs badly, I'll take a few hits and I'll write another book. If you do it in a video game, you'll take a few hits and spend a few tens of millions of dollars and fire a whole bunch of people. So I think the video game industry is being very, I think they're being more play it slow, making the changes, as opposed to Wizards, which is trying desperately to get right out in front of all this, and not just for business reasons. I know the people there, they are thrilled at how many women are playing Dungeons and Dragons now. They are thrilled. I've been at the meetings where they've shown the metrics of what class is being played, and who's playing it, and who's joining the game. And they are just, because what happened with D&D is because of Twitch and some of these other streaming services, the game became so much more accessible to so many more people. If you say, I can't get a D&D group, yes, you can. Go get D&D Beyond, which is a helper for the game, and go get Roll20 or one of those other services that allow you to play virtually, and find a group of people. It doesn't matter where they live, as long as you can all get together for a couple hours, you can play D&D. And one of the things that's really become apparent in the genre to all of us is that we very quickly can begin erasing the barriers, erasing the tropes, erasing the expectations, And by the way, when you're playing D&D, you're supposed to be somebody else. So just do it and accept it and have fun with it. And so I think the computer game industry is I'm not sure, because I'm not really up on a lot of the real cutting edge games. Like, you know way more about this than I do. But I think, you know, the consequence is high. You have to be very careful, but both ways. Because a lot of jobs are on the line and things like that, right?
Sure.
Yeah, so I can't really speak to the computer games. I know what Wizards is doing, and what Wizards is doing is they're saying, you're welcome at the table. And at the same time, they're saying, it's your game. The whole thing about Dungeons and Dragons, one of the things I like the most, is that the rule books are guides. That's all they are. They're guidelines. If you want to have a D&D game with just your old friends from the frat in college and just sit around and throw pizza at each other and drink beer and fart at each other, do it. If you're having fun, you're having fun. If you want to have a D&D game and you're inviting all kinds of new people in there, people you don't know, and they're bringing to the table things that are very different than you and your friends in so many different ways, then do it. Because they're not telling you you must do this. They're showing you maybe other ways that the things that you took for granted had to be done a certain way can be done other ways.
That's excellent. Thank you. And I'm sure we could keep asking more questions, but we wanted to save time to open it up to everybody else. So if there are questions from the audience or if we have streaming questions, now would be a great time for that.
First one's always the hardest to get. We have hands. We have hands. You call on people. I'm not taking it.
I think we have.
Okay. So I want to get into writing. I want to start. I have all these ideas in my head, and I'm just trying to get them out on paper. What would you say is the best way to kind of incorporate or like introduce lore, like, and different bits of world building into the story? Would you say like, do it in like little nuggets throughout the story, or like, have a companion novel full of just like lore, kind of like the Silmarillion was, or how would you do it?
I wouldn't do that. There was a thing going on a few years ago in the publishing industry where all of a sudden they were saying, do not do prologues, right? And I was like, what the hell is this? Do whatever you want. You want to do a prologue, you want to do an epilogue, you want to do a prologue, a prelude, and an epilogue? I don't care. Just tell your story the way it's supposed to be told. But what I found out is that what was happening was everybody was, it's become much easier to write. It hasn't become much easier to write well. It hasn't become much easier to be a writer. But anybody can sit down and type, right? And you've got grammar checker and, spell checker and all the rest of it. So what the publishers were getting were books that had, the prologue in the books were 10,000 word information dumps about the world. And so what are the publishers thinking? If we print this, people are going to read 3 pages and throw the book away and get mad at us. Because people don't want to read that until they're already into the world. If you want someone to read Tolkien and the first book you give them is the Silmarillion, you probably lost 999 out of 1,000 people, right? The way I do it, I know the boundaries of the world. I know the geography of the world. I know who the monsters are. I know why the monsters are. I know the cultures. I know how they interact. And I fell in love with these characters. And these characters are going to take you on an adventure, and you're going to see the world through their eyes. Bit by bit, piece by piece. I may put a little exposition in there to explain something here and there. But other than that, the characters are going to show you their world. And that's hard. That's very hard to do as a writer, because you have these amazing ideas in your head about a world or some gimmick with magic or something, and you just want to write it, but you can't. You got to show it through the eyes of the characters in this context of the story. Patience. And Robert Cormier, who's my hero, another Leominster guy. If you don't know, he's the guy that wrote The Chocolate War, I Am the Cheese, Fade. He's one of the most influential young adult writers of the 20th century. I think he's right up there with anyone you can name, and I think a lot of people will agree with that. When I got my first rejection letters in 1983, 4, I called him. I didn't know him, but his phone number was actually in the movie I Am the Cheese. That was his actual phone number, and I had heard that, so I said, I wonder. Had to write first three numbers, right? 534 or 537, whatever. I was Leominster back then. So I called him. And I told him, I just got these rejection letters, and I'm sorry to bother you, and I just, I didn't know who to reach out to. I don't know anything about the business. He kept me on the phone for 2 hours. I love this man. I miss him every day. And he told me something I've never forgotten. He said, character is more important than plot. You can have the greatest story ever, and if people don't care about your characters, you'll never put any tension into that story. But if you have a character that people have come to love, you give them a hangnail and the reader will say, ouch. And I've lived by that with my writing. That's how I show people my world. It makes it more interesting to them. It may try my patience sometimes when I tell you all the brilliant things I came up with. Isn't this cool? Isn't this cool? Isn't this cool? Well, I mean, I can't show them part 2 and 3 until the 3rd book. What the heck? I want to blur that out. But you got to be patient. You got to let the story tell them and show them the world. I do it like Umberto Eco, right? You read The Name of the Rose and you're learning about. By the way, the show is out. There's a new show out. The Name of the Rose is redone, and it's worth watching, just so you know. But you're doing this murder mystery at a monastery. And if you're reading the book, you come to one part where he's describing a door for like 10 pages. And you can't stop reading it, especially if you grew up Catholic. Oh, that's what that's all about. I wondered why they put that there. It's brilliant. But again, you're introduced to this whole world he's trying to show you. And so many things he's trying to do with language and with the clues and how they solve the mystery. And it's just this magnificent, brilliant piece. And every now and then he'll give you a piece of it. But you see that door when the character walks up to that door. And you see that door, and the character is one interpreting some of that door for you. It's much more powerful that way to the reader. Okay. I'm sorry I killed Julie.
Any other questions? Oh, go ahead, you have some.
So I've been trying to write on and off for years. I'm writing my own D&D homebrew game. And something I've struggled with for years is I have my beginning, I have all my characters, and I have my climax and my end. It's everything in between that I'm having the problem with writing and coming to terms with. What do you do? What helps you figure out those in-between details? What helps you really pinpoint what you need to do to get the plot going?
Okay, I've written around 70 novels at this point. I'm very old. But a lot of them are in series, and that's easier because I know who the characters are. Mm-hmm. In every one of those books, I get really excited when I start it. Oh, here we go. This is going to be a great adventure. And I know what the ending's going to be, although I'm usually wrong. It doesn't go there. And I get to the middle of the book, and I think, who would ever read this crap? I don't want to read this crap, and I'm writing it. Mm-hmm. Happens every book because stories lull. Mm-hmm. This is when you can find anecdotes to better define your characters. This is when you can put scenes that are implied by the relationship between characters that strengthen or disavow people of those relationships. These are the points where you can really do some serious character growth while you're advancing through the slow parts of the story. And I treat an outline like a telephone pole, right? This is the beginning, a middle, and an end. This is the outline. The only reason I even do one is because they won't send me a check if I don't give them an outline, okay? It's the rules. But when I'm writing that book, it grows branches. It becomes a tree. And that tree may lean. And Classic example, Artemis Entreri was put at the end of the Crystal Shard because I liked writing and I wanted him to give me another book, and he was a good hook. The halfling sees him and goes, he's here for me. Oh my God, this is the world's worst assassin. And he's here to kill me. I'm doomed. I thought Entreri was dead in the next book. That was in 1980. I wrote that second book in 1988. He's in the series I'm writing now because he became interesting to me. When I did my Demon Wars series, it was supposed to be a 6-book series. I had this most detailed outline I ever wrote because they were letting me build this whole world. Turned into a 7-book series. And all the people I thought were going to win at the end were dead books before. At one point, one of my sons walks by and he goes, "Oh, Father Abbott so-and-so." "Yeah, he became Father Abbott." "Really? How do you resurrect?" I went, "What?" "Oh, you killed him 3 books ago." There are better tools for authors now to help you have a memory. But the point is, when I went back after I finished that series and I looked at my outline, I was laughing out loud. None of what I thought was going to happen from about book 2.5 on happened. It was completely different. But that's when you figure out the whole plotter or pantser, right? Are you a plotter or are you a pantser? A plotter is someone who does these detailed outlines and will meticulously stick to them. And a pantser is someone who writes an outline, thinks they know what they're going to do, meet the character, throw the outline away, and go on this wild ride all the way through the books. I am pure pantser, okay? So when you get to those slow parts, and you really, and part of the reason you're not liking it is because you really want to tell the ending.
Yeah.
But you can't. You've got to develop some things in there to bring it logically to that ending. One of the things that scares me about people reading on their phones is the whole point of the novel is a logical beginning and middle and end. It is a logic thought from beginning and a consistency run from the beginning to the middle to the end. So develop your characters. You'll get to know them better. And when you do, don't be surprised if your ending doesn't change.
Thank you.
Hi, I just have a quick question about like publishing. What's your best advice when it comes to like publishing nonfiction?
This is a really tough question for me. He's publishing nonfiction or fiction? Fiction.
Sorry, I meant fiction.
Yeah, nonfiction, I have no idea. This is a really tough question for me because I'm going to be in a very different place than you are, okay? When I started, the way you broke into the business was either you got really lucky and put a book in a place that was in desperate need of an author, like I did. If I had submitted my book to TSR 3 months earlier, they weren't looking for someone to write the second Forgotten Realms novel. Forgotten Realms wasn't even out yet. If I had submitted it 3 months later, the orders were coming in for the book that Doug Niles had written, and they were as big as Dragonlance, and even bigger sometimes. And so all of a sudden, all these people that I would have been competing against to write the second Forgotten Realms book, Troy Denning, probably not Margaret and Tracy because they were the Dragonlance king and queen, essentially, but all the other writers that worked for the company, I would have been competing against to do that second novel. So they might have liked it, the potential they saw in the manuscript I sent and the writer that wrote the manuscript that I sent, but I would have been competing against people they knew could produce on time, and produce quality work. So I probably wouldn't have gotten the gig. That's a lucky break. The other way people would come in would be doing short stories. But you can't do that anymore. Because what happens when they do anthologies now? The first thing they do is they call up all the top authors in the field and ask if they want to do a story. They're trying to lure everyone. I got this great idea for an anthology, Bob. You know, Terry Brooks is doing a story, George Martin's doing a story. They said you might be interested, come do the story. They call me. I don't call them. If you submit to that, they're not even reading outside things. It used to be the magazines where you could make your name, but those are mostly gone. There's still some fanzines. So it's hard for me to say how to break in now. Many people, obviously, are self-publishing because it's cheap. You could do that when I started. You would go to, there was one press that used to, as soon as they saw that I had sent out query letters, started sending me spam letters. There was spam back then too, and for $40,000. But my cut would be so much larger. I'd only have to sell 20,000 books. Well, I got news for you. Without a national marketing campaign, 20,000 books? You better have a big family, pal, because you ain't gonna sell 20,000 books. So there are a lot of different ways to do it. I have a friend in Leominster who is writing all kinds of books, and he's self-publishing them, and he knows he's gonna sell between 3,000 and 5,000 copies. Because he's writing topical things. One of his books about JoJo White of the Celtics. He writes books about Leominster's history. He knows who his audience is. He knows who he can write to. He's done all the work to find the right printer and to promote those books correctly. And he's doing a really great job on writing books that he knows will interest a very select target audience. So for him, self-publishing is absolutely the way to do it. Why give the publisher, why take 15%, which is what a publisher will give you on a hardcover, or 10%, which is what they will give you on a paperback, if you're lucky, or some formula that'll say we'll pay you this much for an audiobook or an ebook that may or may not work out to any money at all for you. Why go through all that when you can control everything if you know who your audience is going to be? And if I'm writing a book about Leominster, Massachusetts, I probably don't want it in a bookstore in the Grove in South LA, okay? So, but if you're just writing a book and you want to get going, the best advice I can give someone is don't write a book in an established IP unless you know they're looking for manuscripts. Like if you were to sit down and write a book on the Forgotten Realms, they would say, I can't read this. I saw this happen to a woman one day. She ran up to the editor from Star Wars, Lucasfilm, and she had this gigantic stack of papers. It was, oh, I wrote this book, I love Star Wars, will you please read my book? And the editor, by all legal contract obligations, looked at her in the eye and said, not only can I not read that, but if you let other people read that, you might be getting calls from lawyers. And she was devastated. But that's the sad reality. Now, I would say, if you know someone that's doing an IP that you love, good example of this a few years ago was Buffy the Vampire Slayer. They were doing tons of Buffy the Vampire Slayer books. But it wasn't an A-IP, A-list. It wasn't Star Wars. It wasn't Forgotten Realms. It wasn't Star Trek. You know, the real A-list franchises that are going. If you have a really great idea for a story and something like that, query them. See if they'd be interested in seeing a story like that, because they hire outside writers a lot of time for those. That might be a way. Self-publishing and building a fan base. Then going to the publishers. The Martian was done that way and became huge. Huge audiobook, huge movie, right? That's a way to do it. Chris Paolini built his career with the Homeschool Network and driving around the Northwest with his parents on a self-published book. They would go to every convention, they would go to every school that would have them, and he built an audience. And Carl Hyacinth was up there fishing with his kid, and he got one of the books, and his kid was reading and said, this is really good. It was Aragon. And Carl went back to his publisher and said, you should take a look at this. Chris Paolini has had a wonderful career since then, after self-publishing. And I know less about this than you can find out from online writing groups. Go to fan forums. Go to online writing groups. Ask them what they're doing. Ask them how they're doing it. I will warn you, if you're going to do something like a Kickstarter, make sure you know what you're doing in terms of cost, because you will go broke very quickly if you're not careful. The good news is it's way easier to publish a book today than it used to be because of ebooks. The bad news is everybody's publishing books, so it's way harder to get noticed. There's no hopper. The publishers used to act as this giant hopper, right? This giant funnel, and you get all these submissions coming in, and a few would get through, and those were the ones the readers were told were worth reading. And so you had to go through a publisher. You don't have to anymore. But getting that word out, you know, whether it's a friend you have who's an influencer on whatever they influence on, right? Book Talk, or the Tick Book or Book Talk? I feel like Bill Belichick right now, my face. Book Talk is how books make the New York Times now. People unwrap the book on TikTok and talk about how much they love the book. So those kind of things I don't know, I don't do, I don't have to do. In fact, in most cases, I'm prohibited from doing because the publishers pay people to do things like that. I just write the book, argue with editors, and then hopefully maybe go out for a couple of book signings. That's about it. Go to online writing groups. Find an online writing group. There are plenty of them. Check the local libraries and see if, but if you do that, the other thing I will give as a caution is the worst critics in the world are wannabe authors. It's the truth. They will be brutal. Stay true to your writing. Know what you want to write. Write the book you want to write, not the book somebody tells you should write. Yeah, and I wish I could be more help, but 25 years ago, I could have given you a much better answer to that. The other thing is go look for things like the Writer's Market, which is a periodical, comes out, I think, twice a year. It used to be twice a year. I don't know if it still is. But that'll tell you where to submit your book and what they want when you submit the book. And that's important, to send it to the right person. I would go to PAX East. I would go to NorEastCon. I would go to Total Confusion down in Marlborough in February. Wonderful little convention. There are editors there. There are writers there. There are game designers there. There are comic book people there. I would go there. I would sit down. I would listen. Learn the business. I wish I could be more help. The world is very different than when I was coming up.
Okay, so we had 2 questions online. There was one that asked about the biggest challenge in getting published. So I'm going to ask the other question, and that is, what do you think about Drizzt Magic the Gathering card and how it opened the world for people into finding your other works?
Yeah, that's they actually they did the Drizzt Magic the Gathering card years ago as an April Fool's joke, and it said, when you play this card, your opponent loses. we went right from Munchkin land with him. I am seeing a lot of this now, right? You got the Funko Pop figures, you got the Caddy Brie and Drizzt, you got this creepy guy that keeps looking over my shoulder. I am seeing you can get the scimitars now. They're doing a lot of other things around him. Did anyone see the video Sleep Sound? I did. Wizards called me up and they said, we want you to write a poem, a lullaby for the drow. I said, a lullaby for the drow? And they said, yeah, we want you to do a lullaby. And I'm like, that's kind of dumb, no. And they said, no, this is going to be fun. We want you to do a drow lullaby. And by the way, Benedict Cumberbatch is going to read it. All right, I'm in. I bet they paid him more than they paid me. Damn it. So we did this thing called Sleep Sound. And it's the lullaby I wrote that Benedict Cumberbatch, in his best Vincent Price voice, it's wonderful. And they did this beautiful music for it, and they did this kind of fade screen animation to it, this kind of 2-dimensional animation, if you will. And it got like millions of views. Amazing. You can still find it, but it's pirated now because it's officially pulled down, but you can still find it if you look. And all of these things that are happening around, for me, means more readers. If for me, and my publisher actually said this to me, we can't believe that after 35 years, and it's 39 novels with these characters, but there's 5 other ones off to the side with the cleric books, and there's 3 other ones that I wrote with my son that were young adult books off to the side. And there's all these short stories and see, we can't believe after all of this, you're still picking up young readers. You're staying relevant. I said, thank my kids. They tell me when I'm stupid. But all of these things are helping me continue my career. So I'm absolutely thrilled about it. I'm flattered by it. I don't know if it's announced yet, so I can't say it. Damn it. I hate these things. They don't tell me what I can say and what I can't. Wait a minute, I can. They did announce it at ECCC. Next year there'll be a webtoon about Breezy, Drizzt's daughter. And I'm work every Thursday. I'm on a call with Perpa, who's the writer, and with the artist. I'm not sure if he's putting his name out there yet, but who's amazing. And Perpa has a webtoon called Suit or Armor, which is like the number 1 or 2 fantasy webtoon out there. And I'm working with this writer who's writing my character and an artist who's drawing my characters while we're on the Zoom call. And it is fantastic. It makes me feel like it's gotten bigger than me, like it'll outlast me. And I think that's pretty damn cool. And when I talk about my book signings now, like Fleetwood Mac concerts, the feeling I get when a grandfather comes walking up to me with his son and his granddaughter, all of whom are reading the book together, that is like the most heartwarming feeling an author can have. So I think it's just grand. And I don't even play Magic.
We have two questions back there.
Hello. All right, so I'm running a D&D group for my own campaign, and one of the main villains that I have them going against is I set them up and introduced him as a completely one-dimensional, this character is evil, just go out and defeat him. But I'm starting to realize that as this is going, it's because the flatness that I introduced to him with is just not doing it anymore. Do you have any recommendations of what I can do that's both A, not hand-fisted, and B, not like completely just changing the character outright, that could add like more depths and like satisfactions for dealing with this guy who's just messed in the head?
You ever watch like Walking Dead?
I have not.
You haven't or have?
No.
Okay. They introduce characters that are seemingly irredeemably evil, and then like one guy in particular, and then you find out he's got his daughter who is now a zombie chained in the closet because he can't let her go, and it has completely broken him. World of Warcraft did some really nice work with this, actually, when they did the story of Arthas. So I guess the thing to do is side quests for your characters where they find out maybe why this guy is behaving the way he's behaving a little bit. Maybe they find the village where he came from, and or this, I don't know, is it a person? Is it an elf? Is it a monster? What is it? The bad guy.
So basically, he's some like ancient immortal guy, and just like the main thing is that he's taking like the local wildlife and just like turning them into chimeras and just letting them loose. So it's kind of hard for me to conceive a reason of why someone would just go and do that.
Well, that's the first thing you got to figure out. What happened to him?
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, and there's a new module that the new campaign setting that we're actually playing now called the Radiant Citadel that just came out, and it has a lot of things like that in it, where things aren't as they seem, and it's really well done. Take a look at that. Take a look at Radiant Citadel. They're doing like the whole concept of it was wonderful because they're taking people from not Western European folklore culture and letting them showcase their cultures with it, like the Day of the Dead and things like that. And it's wonderfully done, and some really great stories of that probably come from folklore in their cultural history of things that seem bad that aren't, or things that seem bad for a reason that you have to uncover. So I would look to things like that. Those kinds of stories where when suddenly that character, that villain, becomes more than a villain. When it becomes someone with motivations, maybe who thinks he's doing the right thing. Hope it works.
Hi. I would like to talk about the dark elf controversy a little bit. I don't want to put words in your mouth, so I think I want to kind of just talk about what I heard and ask you if that's correct, and then I have my question. I don't want to take up too much time, so is it appropriate if I talk about this?
I'm fine with it.
So from my understanding, when developing the characters in D&D, and specifically the Dark Elf, you guys draw inspiration from different cultures. However, none of these characters are necessarily defined by those cultures. This is a dark elf, as opposed to like a black man. Am I reading that correctly?
Sometimes.
Okay.
No, I'm not trying to be evasive. Sometimes, like, the answer will be they're elves. And people that are saying it earnestly. They're not humans. This is not related to that. Sometimes. But go ahead.
I think the core of my question, and I purely want your perspective on this, I think with something like the Dark Elf, they're truly defined as the Dark Elf within the play space. I'm a game designer, and I'm really interested in the ways that race, sex, and sexuality are depicted in various forms of media. I could watch something like The Imitation of Life, which is a beautifully crafted story about race. I'm curious about your perspective of a narrative like that existing in the play space, specifically something less like Dungeons and Dragons, where it's crafted by the character, but something more like this is a story being told about race to the player and how that could exist. I'm just interested in your perspective.
No, that's a great question, actually. I'm not afraid to give my perspective on things, as you can probably tell by now.
Yes, and I appreciate that.
Someone said to me, but no, the Drow are evil. They were made black because they're evil. And I said, you don't see a problem with that? Really? Because that is something, you have to understand that there's a lot of people who are just oblivious to that type of stuff, especially older people, who are just oblivious to that type of stuff, who are oblivious to the fact that it wasn't just Caucasian, black, or whatever. It's the degree. How dark-skinned are they? Do they pass? All of these things in history that you don't necessarily know about unless you read about them. So with the Dark Elves, which we call them Drow, they are Drow. One of the things I did before I wrote about Caladay, where I'm doing a new society, is Evan Winter, who wrote Rage of Dragons. He's a phenomenal. The Rage of Dragons is one of my favorite books. I'm not even a third of the way through it, and I already know it's one of my favorite books. And apparently the sequel's even better. Evan agreed to talk to me because I wanted him to show me the perspectives that I didn't have. As a white guy growing up in an Italian neighborhood in the Northeast, I had like 3 friends who were people of color growing up. And Evan graciously gave me hours of his time, and he wrote the foreword for the Tao of Drizzt because Drizzt inspired him. But the reactions I've gotten about Drizzt from several different people that I've gone to and said, help me understand these new sensibilities, have been all over the place. I spoke to Evan, he said, I was just glad to see a hero who looked like me for a change. And Drizzt is a hero. I spoke to Ramon Terrell, who's a dear friend of mine, who's a writer, self-publishing author out in California, and he said, Drizzt is black. Because he said, I never looked at him as black. Ramon also is black. Mm-hmm. I read a piece by a Pakistani philosopher named Ali Etaraz, who was doing some really great work right after 9/11, and trying to bridge that gap and say, this is not representative. Let's have a talk. And he read a piece called I Am a Dark Elf. He wrote it. And he talks about when he was a kid that came over from Pakistan, and his father was very strict Muslim and would only let him read the Quran. But he stuffed my books in the middle. And he used my books to teach him about assimilation into a society that may reject him. I'm not going to apologize for that. I think that's fantastic, right? This is why I'm not afraid to talk about this, because when I make mistakes, people will tell me, and hopefully I'll learn, right? Mm-hmm. My books are about individual agency. My books really are about the content of a character, of the character, if you will.
Do you think that there can be a play space fantasy where the the idea of a dark elf, that context can be removed, and this is a narrative about race. Maybe that's not a
Yes.
fair question.
No, yes, I absolutely do. Think there can be a context in fantasy that that gets away from all of those things. I think we're seeing it now. When you read Shannon Chakraborty's books about gin culture, when you read N.K. Jemisin, when you read, you know, the genre has expanded, and it's all a good thing. It is all a good thing. No more chicks in chainmail. No more damsels in distress. No more defining things superficially. You're not going to get away with it. Whether it's race-based or gender-based or whatever, you're not going to get away with it anymore. So yeah, I absolutely think you can do that. I think I'm doing some of that in my newer books, where I've introduced a new culture of people who have golden skin, and they have the face of a mandrill with the red nose and the white and the blue, and they're called the Jokanai, and they're out of the southwestern parts of the continent. But they're all about the light. They're all about the goodness and the light. And they turn out to be the British in the pirate books. So I think we're all trying to do that now and get away from those concepts, or at least present them more equitably, if that makes sense. So like my solution to the drow in the Dungeons and Dragons game was, let me show you the underbelly of Menzoberranzan, the people who hate Loth but can't escape, like Dritz. Let me show you a culture that isn't dominated by a demon tyrant, to get away from all of that. I think I did it with Dark Mirror, when Dritz sees a goblin who challenges everything he ever thought. So yeah, I think there's room. I think there's absolutely room for all of that stuff.
Okay. Thank you very
and
much
I
for
think
your
now,
honesty.
if you're going to write something like that, now is the time to do it. Because the publishers of games and books are clamoring for things that help them break down the barriers of the genres. You're very welcome.
How you doing? Thanks so much for doing this. So I have probably a dozen questions I could ask you myself, but my two best friends growing up were both huge super fans of your work. My friend Andy's probably a librarian. At least 80% of the reason of that is him reading your novels. So I wanted to ask something on his behalf. He wanted to know, he has a question about editors and publisher-driven story decisions. He said, by all accounts, that you wanted Wolger's death to stick, but you were sort of forced to bring him back. And over the sort of course of your novels, there have been various people that have sort of died and then come back. And so I know you've written so much work that probably can't cover all of them, but if you could just maybe talk about that, and maybe one of those decisions about a character that you brought back and that was sort of your decision versus maybe something that was driven by editors.
They were my decisions, but they were done for different reasons. Okay, Wolfgar's death, he didn't die. One of the things I have to do, I'm writing buddy fantasy, right? People care about these characters. You should read my letters sometime. I mean, these are people, I've had kids come up to me crying saying, I didn't have a friend in high school until I read your books. That matters to me. I don't want to rip that away from them. The Dritz books don't serve that purpose. My Demon War books don't fall in love because people are going away. But in the Dritz books, I'm very conscious about that. With these core characters, they become so iconic to people and getting rid of them. And whether I should, with Wolfgar, as with Bruner at the end of Streams of Silver, when he's riding the dragon down, and only one letter of the hundreds of letters I got about that book, he got it, and the kid goes, Bruner's not dead. He has Dritz's sword. That'll protect him from the fire. I said, you got it. Shh. Shh. Is to create tension and make people, even the reader, believe somebody's dead without actually killing them. Because otherwise the series wouldn't have gone 39 books. It would have gone about 4, and they'd all be dead. The exception to that was when Wizards of the Coast made what still is, like, I think the worst decision they ever made, and introduced 4th edition D&D and in doing so, advance the world 100 years. We were at a meeting. Ed Greenwood was sitting next to me, and they told, we had just gotten the Bible of the New World, and I went, you can't do this. We're trying to give people a place to jump on, to reinvigorate the line. And I said, you're giving people a reason to jump off, because you're advancing the world 100 years. You're saying my next book has to be 100 years in the future. What do I do with Kathy Bree? What do I do at Regis? What do I do at Bruno? What do I do at Intreri? What do I do at Wolfgang? They wouldn't bend. We walked out of the meeting. Ed Greenwood and I looked at each other. Ed was devastated. This was his world. It's the world he built. And then he goes, what are we going to do? And I said, we're going to outsmart them. Because in a few years, when most of the people who made these decisions no longer work for the company because it tanked, they're going to call us. And they're going to say, we need you to fix the realms. So how are we going to do it? I said, the realms has gods. All the gods do things a little differently. Go out and figure out how your characters with their various gods, their gods would know that when this sundering was over, they want them back in there championing their cause, so they put them in a pocket somewhere and take them back out when the sundering's over. I did that with 4 of my characters, the companions of the hall, all of whom were gone. In the meantime, my interlude books, before I brought them back, which I never thought I was going to be able to do, but in case what I predicted would happen, I may be able to do it. I told stories of Dritz falling in with a different crowd of people, a very nastier crowd of people who did not have the loyalty, the ethics, the bond that he had with the companions of the hall, and how it was driving him insane, essentially. And at the end of those books, Dritz and his lover have a falling out, and she whomps him up top the head with her magical staff, and he's bleeding, he's concussed. He gets to the top of Kelvin's cairn, where he used to walk with Bruno in his younger days and look at the stars, and he's basically dying. And his panther's beside him, and Dritz is dying at the end of the last threshold. Spoiler alert, book's 10 years old, too bad. Then I got to write the companions. And I did in the companions what you're never supposed to do in a book. I brought people back. But I did it because, sure as heck, Bob, we got a problem. We need you and Ed to fix the realms. No kidding. Sometimes I feel smart. So what I knew I'm committing a mortal sin here, because you're taking all tension out of the books when you do this. If people can be resurrected like an MMO, why do you care if they get killed, right? If a priest can just go, stand up, okay, you're fine. Oh, let me heal that scratch, go back to battle. There's no tension. So I made sure it was known as a one-off. And I brought them back. And they were in this forest from the goddess Mylaki, that was Dritz's god, that he, not anymore, but was Kathy Bree's goddess. And they were all gathered there in this forest. Time passed differently, so 100 years passed, and now they were given a choice that Kathy Bree discovered. They could walk out of the forest and be reborn into new bodies with full consciousness and memory, which I thought's kind of cool, right? That's the old, if I knew then what I know now, right? I get to live that fantasy. And so Regis, Kathy Bree, and Bruner did it all for different reasons. Kathy Bree did it because this was her journey with Dritz, and she had to see it through to the end when he could finally get rid of Loth, her hold on him completely. And that meant the hold of being damaged from coming from that society, just in the way he saw himself. So she knew she had to go back and stand by Dritz, her husband. Regis said he decided to go back, the halfling, because in the early books, he was just the tag-along character, right? He was the one they all had to protect all the time. And he was determined, well, I'm going to know from the beginning all of this. That's not going to happen again. I'm going to be the best little thief I can be, the best little rogue I can be. And so there's some of the early scenes where Regis in his crib, when nobody's looking, he's playing with his buttons to try and develop better dexterity with his fingers. He's playing with the buttons on his little nightie that he's wearing, right? So Regis had a motivation to come back. I get another chance to not be the tag-along. I can be a hero too. Bruner came back out of duty to his friends, and he was pissed about the whole thing because I did all of this. I reestablished Mithril Hall. I found Gauntlgrim. I did this. I became king of the dwarves again. I did this. All these accomplishments. I died in glory. I'm supposed to be going to Moradin's table in glory. very similar to like the Viking mythology, if you will. He was supposed to go to his reward, but he couldn't. He had to go be reborn again and do this all over again, which made a mockery of his first existence. So basically, Bruner was taking the place of the readers who would say, you can't do this, right? And so Bruner was just bullshit through the whole story. Then he kind of liked being a young dwarf again. So Wolfgar didn't come back. He went, Wolfgar, in the short story I wrote about him post the earlier books, when he had gone back to Icewind Dale, lived to be 105 years old, was killed by a Yeti in a battle, in a great battle. He had kids, grandkids, great-grandkids, lots of them. Wolfgar was like, I fulfilled everything. I did my dream, I did my life, I did everything you're supposed to do in this existence. I'm ready for whatever's next. He went into the lake. So the three of them come back. During the course of the book, they decide to meet on Kelvin's cairn on this night, and this was the god's interference. That was the night Dritz was up there dying. So they basically got up there and saved Dritz, because Myliki did not want her hero to die until he got to fight the Avatar of Loath. So they get up there and they find Dritz. So everything's going along. We're fixing the realms. We're kind of giving a reset for the readers. And I'm writing this, and I get to a point, and Guinevere, the panther, her ears go back, and she gives a growl. And at that moment, I knew Wolfgar was coming up the hill. On the last page of the book, I had no idea. So I'm like, well, why would Wolfgar come back? What's his? I know what the other three came back for, as I'm thinking about. Well, Wolfgar said in the first life, I did everything you're supposed to do. I did everything right. I am married. We had kids. We had grandkids. We did everything. I did my adventuring. I was the hero. I did this. I'm just going to have fun this time around. And he is like a pure hedonist going forward. He's just out there, let's have fun. He's like, Jarlaxle's like, I like this guy. Hey, I want you to meet some dragons. We'll have a blast, trust me. So I'm able to do different things with the characters again, which made it fresh for me too. But again, my decision, but that was a decision that my hand was forced, because I was not ready to be done with these characters. And the only way I was going to be able to finish my stories with them was bring them back. The other character of the books, there was one other character who came back, it's Dritz's father. And I did that just to throw a monkey wrench into the whole thing. And when it was amazing to me is Dritz's father comes back. Now, he died in the first book, and then died again as a zombie in the second book. He doesn't know where he's been. He doesn't know what his afterlife was or wasn't. He knows nothing. He knows who he was. It's almost like somebody gave him, a sleeping potion that put him out Rumpelstiltskin style for like 160 years, right? And now he's back. His son lives on the surface. Well, how'd he get out? He got out? He got away? His son married a human? Wait a minute. Because Zaknafein has not escaped the Drow. He has not escaped their cultural prejudices. And so in the first book, he comes back, and he's trying to be nice, but he can't understand why his son would marry an inferior being like a human. You should see the letters I got about that. You made Zaknafein a racist. I said, no, I made Zaknafein a human being. Let's see how he gets through this. Patience. His whole world is inverted. I am going to have half drow, half human grandchildren? Where he came from. The drow had words for humans, and they weren't good words. He'd never met a human before. And now he's got a daughter-in-law who's one. How would he react? He's Archie Bunker. That's who he's Archie Bunker. Trying to figure out a world that changed, like anybody would do. So again, I brought him back to throw a monkey wrench in the whole thing and to have some fun and to make some points.
Thank you so much.
Sure. Don't fall in love with people in Demon Wars.
This is going to be the last question of the night.
Okay.
Hi, so I wanted to ask, what do you think of how video games are now evolving along with popularizing D&D and how it's pushing forward new things for the D&D community?
I think the best thing has happened is D&D Beyond and Roll20, things like that. because it's allowed people to not have, if friends move away, you can still have your group, and you can play as if you're in the same room. It's a wonderful experience. But I think with the video games like Cryptic and all of that, it's just expanding a world that, and I give Ed Greenwood the genius of his creation when he created this world, because he created a standard fantasy world that had twists all over the place, and a lot of open room for a lot of creative people to come in and put their stamp on it. The Forgotten Realms was built by a team of dozens and scores and hundreds of people over. Well, this is the funniest thing. Ed Greenwood looks like Gandalf. Okay, he's got this big gray beard. He looks exactly the same as when I met him in 1989 at Gen Con. He looks the same. A few years ago, I turned 60. And that summer was Gen Con, and someone asked me if I would be there, and I thought I was going to be at that time. And they said, we're going to do a big 60th birthday party for Ed Greenwood. And I went, oh, that's, Ed Greenwood's younger than I am? He looks the same, with a big gray beard and unkempt hair. He looks like a frazzled Gandalf. And I said, wait a minute, this can't be right. This can't be right. Because Ed created the Forgotten Realm. I looked at him and I said, Ed, what were you, like 9 years old when you created the realms? He said, well, I was 6. I hate him. But the world is so big. It's so rich. It's got dozens of creators working in it. They find their mission, they keep going. So all of these other things that are going on around it are just giving more people a place to play games. And by playing games, I mean just escaping the real world for a little while, which is a good thing. So I love it.
All right, well, that's a great place to wrap up.
Perfect.
Say thank you for everybody joining us here today in person and online, and a big thank you again to Bob for joining us.
Oh,
We
it's my
appreciate
alma
you
mater.
being here, so thank you so much.
Yes, Fitchburg State College. I put down I was going to be at Fitchburg State University, and someone from my era came on my Twitter and said, excuse me, how old are you? It's Fitchburg State College to you.
Just note as well that at 5:30, the RP Guild and some other groups are going to be doing a game night in the library, so if you wanted to play a little D&D, it's right over there.
Very cool.
All right. Thank you so much.
I would just like to quickly say thank you on behalf of the Alumni Association for coming out today. And you have a nice bag of Fitchburg State goodies. Unfortunately, they are either just Fitchburg State or Fitchburg State University.
That's fine with me. My wife's going to steal it all anyway.
Green and gold.
Thank you. Thank you. You get to keep it dressed.
We do get to keep it dressed. So, please, there are cookies.
Cookies.
Beverages, if anybody's interested. I didn't know if you wanted to, if you were going to sign.
Yeah, certainly. Certainly.
I have pens.
Yeah, I have pens.